Welcome everyone. My name is Eve Barabbas and I'm the chair for BCS South Yorkshire. Welcome to our event for January 2023. Without further ado, passing over to Stuart to introduce himself.
Thank you very much. So, Stuart Barker, I'm the MD of Corcom Quality Engineering. We're a professional services organisation specialising in test and development. Right, so without further ado, I shall crack on. Hopefully the clicker works. There's and then the first button to just do anything. One clicker. There maybe?
Yeah.
No.
Could I just try? It's just because he's on sun.
Just test this shit. Should have tested it first, shouldn't I? Fail.
I know it's not that kind of a testing talk, but yes, you should have tested it first.
Right, let's have a go. Right, yes, it's working now. Perfect. Right, so a little bit of an introduction as to who I am. So I think personally it's important that when you stood up in front of people professing to know something about subject matter, that you at least give some sort of context and background as to why you think you know what you're talking about. So that'll be the first slide, and then I'm going to give an overview of CQE, just briefly what we do as an organisation. Brief history of Black Friday, where it came from, what it is. Why sales can be more problematic, particularly from a performance testing perspective. I'll then talk about a fictional client, which is what the presentation is centred around. There's a section on the project and the dual track risk mitigation activities that they were planning to, or that they implemented. I'll cover the IT landscape, what all the testing was taking place in. An overview of the performance testing that took place, as you hope. It's important that we get a quick look at what sales order management process looks like, just so people can appreciate the complexities of what the performance testing involved. And then I will demonstrate what I think, anyway, good performance testing looks like. I'm sure Phil Lee on the call will correct me if I'm wrong. And then talk about the tuning that took place. I will profess it was some time ago this, so I've probably forgotten some of the finer details, but I can probably still talk through it fine. And then what the overall, the important thing from a customer perspective, the outcome of this testing activity. And then a final thought. So let's start going through this. So my possibly uninteresting career path. So started life in Sanderson. I think it was Sanderson PSS at the time, back in 1997. I used to sponsor Sheffield Wednesday for those who can remember. I don't know if anyone's a Wednesday or a United fan in here. Briefly worked at a company called Matrix Technologies. I was doing dev at the time, so I had a technical background. Went to work for Accenture, consultant, moved around doing lots of different kinds of roles. And it was Accenture who introduced me to performance testing, and testing in general, to be quite honest, more specifically performance testing. Switched over to CSC, was a DBA there for a while. That was an interesting journey. Then I went to work for Focus Frame, and that was great. So that was another testing specialist based in Holland. So it was great. I got to live in Holland for quite a few years. Places like Hilversum, Haarlem, Amsterdam as well. So that was great. They were sold to a company called Hexaware. Wasn't so great. Left. And I went to work for SDL in Sheffield again. So I live locally, so it was a local company for me. Then went to work for Morrison's in Bradford. I was their performance testing specialist, working on a massive Oracle EBS program implementation there. So I was there for a couple of years. And then you might call went to the dark side, so I went contracting. So I stayed contracting for quite a while, doing a variety of performance testing, test management, testing related roles for a number of years before founding CQE in 2016. So in a nutshell, that was me. Right, so who are CQE? So I won't read that out, but CQE are a group of companies, just briefly, a group of companies consisting of recruitment, training and professional services. And we testing specialists and dev specialists across a number of different areas. We've got the recruitment team that help people recruit people. I won't go over this too much. Professional services and dev automation, and our technology academy is to help businesses train talent and provide a sustainable pipeline. I think the term is that the guys need to use. So moving on from that. Okay, so what is Black Friday? So I was under the impression that it was something to do with the fact that, you know, it's kind of one of the urban myths, I suppose, that you hear about it, but it's not something to do with the fact that retailers are selling things so cheaply that they're running at a loss, therefore they're in the red. And then eventually on Black Friday and Christmas and other events such as that, they sell so much stuff because they have so little margins, apparently, that selling so much on a Black Friday or on this particular event puts them in the black. So it's apparently not. What it is, apparently, so I've read, is only America would have a statue of Rocky for a fictional boxer, but let's move on from that. But it's believed to date back to the 1960s, where police in Philadelphia obviously had issues with crowds coming in, large number of tourists, traffic jams, accidents, shoplifting, etc. I think that's continued on now, hasn't it? If you look at the States and some of the crazy stuff that takes place with people fighting over TVs and God knows what else. I think we've all seen it on the TV. But that's essentially where Black Friday is allegedly comes from. So what's the problem with more sales on Black Friday? So I recently, Andy will laugh at this because he thought this was a tenuous thing. But I recently went to see Mr. Cox at Sheffield Arena to talk about quantum mechanics and various other things I didn't understand, but I found really interesting. And I was thinking, I must be able to get something to do with quantum mechanics, make myself sound smart, start at least. So I came up with this. So you know, IT systems, certainly from a performance perspective, IT systems, they're there, working in the background, and just when you need them the most, i.e. Black Friday, they aren't quite in the state you expected them to be. That's some sort of quantum thing going on there. So what does that really mean? So from a quantum, this is the tenuous thing. So let's just say, I think this is interesting, quantum entanglement. I don't fully understand it, I'm not going to confess to it. But it's an interesting subject where you've got two things, I don't know what you used to call those,
subatomic particles.
Subatomic particles, and it may or may not be, I'm not too sure if it's subatomic particles, but we'll go with that because it sounds impressive. So you could look at your two subatomic particles, in fact, let's use coins. Well, in fact, let's use the balls there. Two balls, could be anything, really, I don't think it really matters. But your two balls, and until you look at them, they could be either in the state of red or yellow until you actually look at them. And once you've looked at them, then if one's yellow, then the other's yellow, if one's red. And if you look at it again, if one's red, the other one's red. The point being that, you know, that could be the system was working fine, that could be the system wasn't working fine. And it's only when it really matters that you find out just if the system is working or not, unless you've done something about it to make sure that the system is going to operate correctly. The tenuous link to quantum entanglement, just because Brian considered a bit of a hero. So setting the scene for our fictional client. So I obviously wouldn't want to use the real client's name for fear of embarrassing them. Oh, not really embarrassing them, because you know they were a good client. So what I did was I came up with some random stuff. So I thought, right, and you can see I've been crazy on PowerPoint with these transitions as the items come in. So I thought I'll choose a girl's name to start with, and then I'll choose some random food products. I mean, it doesn't get any more random than this, does it? Right. I'll choose some random food products, and then I'll choose an industry. I mean, to be fair, the industry wasn't that random because I've done a lot of work in what will become retail. but you know. So Debbie, I'm getting my random Debbie. And there's Paul Daniel's wife, I believe. Oh, Paul Daniel's moved Debbie, I'm not sure, but that was Paul Daniel's wife. And I've got some hams, just some random food products. So you know, Debbie hams, and then I've got the retailer. So it's Debbie hams, the retailer. So it's all completely random. So any likeness to any retailer goes by a similar name, purely coincidental. Right, let me select the next one. So it's so the project side, and it's safe to say that the level of confidence wasn't particularly great. So much so that they had two tracks taking place. They had the test and tune track, which I was the lead on. And then they had the let's rip it all out track. It's not very good. We'll put a new version in because, you know, I won't guess at the motivations of IBM at the time, but I'm sure it's, you know, it was all for the right reasons. So why the confidence was so low in the test and tune track was it had been attempted before, apparently many times. So I was told by the tech guys, and it all failed. Nothing had ever improved. So it was considered unachievable by all the techie guys. Like, I don't know why you both remember this test and tune business, lads. It's never going to work. It was also time bound. So as you'll see, as I'll bring up the other stuff on the other side, that project had kicked off. So there was a deadline for that project, and you know, inevitably it would have slipped. But it was still time bound, and you know, the clock was ticking. It needed to be done in a certain amount of time. Otherwise, we're so far through, rip it all out that it wouldn't be worth the bother. And then it was just general apathy. So speaking to the techie guys, it was like, you know, shrugging shoulders about tuning things. Speaking to the management guys, like, why are you bothering with this, Stuart? It's never going to work. We've tried it out before, and so it was difficult. And it had roughly the project, thinking that it was roughly a budget of about 250k. So that's what was getting spent on testing. You might think that's quite expensive. You might not. So that was me looking a bit glum, but you know, chin up.
You okay?
I had hair, I had 2 pieces of hair. Yeah. Now, if I leave it long enough, I do get those 2 pieces of hair back. So the Rip It All Out team, obviously it wasn't called the Rip It All Out team, it had something a lot more fancy than that, but the Rip It All Out team, they were getting a new system. We're getting new hardware, so you can imagine all the techie guys' eyes lighting up. They had a really enthusiastic team, as you can imagine, doing something new, exciting, new system, it's all brilliant. It was in progress, which didn't really help my case, but there you go, for a challenge. And there was significant pressure from the senior management team to, you know, that this side had to work, especially because no one had any confidence that this side was going to work. And out of the budget of, I think it was more than this, but it was at least £10 million to do that implementation. And that was back in around 2014. So, you know, it's still a lot of money now, but it was even more money back then. So that team was really enthusiastic. That wasn't me, this was somebody else who didn't have any hair. Right then, so what did the IT landscape look like? So people who work in IT probably think, Jesus, right? And I'm only actually kidding, that's not really what the IT landscape looked like. But you've probably seen many diagrams that look like that when you first join your client site. And it's just like, oh my God, how do I even begin to fathom what that environment looks like? And so it's only kidding, but only slightly. Right? I have seen diagrams that come close to that level of craziness. So what I did was I'm always one for, well, I think you need to, it's absolutely essential to be quite honest, understand the IT landscape when you're looking at performance testing, performance engineering. Because you need to understand what levers you need to pull, you need to understand where the risks are, and you just need to understand it to do your job properly, in my humble opinion. So I won't talk about this diagram too much, but this was one I created at the time, which is a simplified view. You don't need to read any of this, but it's a simplified view of the landscape where the performance testing is taking place. And I'll come back to this. in the next slide. But just to give you a flavour of the complexity of the landscape, which is in reality quite simple. Okay, so the classic approach to performance testing. So I am going to use some names that some people might disagree with, and I can have a conversation with it. But the classic piece of performance testing would be you gradually increase. This is one of the tests. I've got the rest of them on this slide as well. So over time, you would increase throughput, whatever that might consist of. You continue to increase throughput forever over time until the system stops responding. That is determining the capacity of the system, and that's why I don't call it a stress test. It's determining the capacity of the systems, which is why I refer to it as a capacity test. And the man would laugh from years ago to hear me saying that. With performance testing, however, what you should do is, first of all, establish a baseline of what normal performance looks like. So it's pointless doing a capacity test, or not necessarily a capacity test actually, but it's pointless doing some other test types if you don't know what normal looks like, because you've got nothing to compare it to. So the first thing you should do is establish your baseline. And then you might do, well, it isn't necessarily in this order, but you might do a soak test, which is generally a higher level of throughput than your baseline. It doesn't have to be, it's really configurable, that one. And that runs over a period of time to see how the system copes and operates over 24 hours, 48 hours, 8 hours, depending on what the requirements are. And that's to determine issues like, you know, the classic one of a memory leak or hard disks filling up when the storage hasn't been configured properly. And another one you would do is a peak test. So you generally look at your track record, you might think Black Friday, you might think Christmas, other events that cause the traffic on the system to increase. And you do a test to simulate that, see what that looks like. Does it work? What's the performance like compared to the baseline? There's usually some level of leeway you get with the peak test compared to your baseline, because as long as performance returns to normal after the peak, then everyone's generally happy. And then what I would call a stress test is, and others might call it a spike test as well, is you would increase the load on the system to a point where it was under stress. And then you would drop the load off back to peak, leave it run, raise the load again, see how the system operates, keep dropping it back up again. So that this is much more what I would refer to as a stress test, because it's all very well that it works kind of at this first point. Well, people can't see me pointing, but online, but it's all very well that the system copes with the load at this point and then recovers to the performance that you've seen in that isolated peak test. But once you've done that a few times, that can cause your systems to start to get into a little bit of trouble. You might have a little tiny memory leak that starts to materialize at some point. And if you do this test repeatedly over a period of time, it may or may not identify that you've got an issue with your system under stress. So teams that I've worked with before introduced, for example, nightly reboots to help address some of these issues, or lots of other issues with it, but nightly reboots to help address memory leaks. And this is the type of test that helps identify problems such as that. That's how performance testing would classically happen for most organizations, rightly or wrongly at certain points in the program. So usually this type of thing, again, I would say it wasn't a great idea, but this type of testing takes place at the end of a project, end of a program, when it's often a lot more expensive to do anything about it. You should really be engineering performance in right from the start of your project so that you can address performance issues whilst it's cheaper. Classic defect prevention, really. So what does the order management system look like? So the client that we're talking about here, there was a website, typical Amazon style thing, where you could order stuff, set those orders to a back-end order management system. And what does an order management system do? So it receives orders and cancellations, and there's more to it than this, of course, but this is more or less what it does. It it updates inventory, i.e. as you sell different products. It sends notifications to fulfillment centres to send products to clients, sometimes incorrectly, as I found out. And the fulfillment centre sends status updates back to the order management system. So as you will have seen it in your mail, you know, the system's been, actually maybe you haven't seen it to this level, but it's been dispatched or it's been picked, it's been whatever the statuses you may get for an order delivery system. How many think of any of those? We just those two. And then it would receive product updates. So you've got like the name of a product, and all of a sudden it might change. Some of the specifications might change. So it handles all that. So that's basically what a simplified order management system has to cope with. So this new, so what did Black Friday introduce? And Black Friday. So it introduced this concept that I coined at the time called microbursts. So what we had, and it's quite logical when you think about it, but what we had was client, the online provider of products, or retailers, for the way to describe it, might decide that they wanted to sell watches, and they've got a particular watch, they're going to sell it for, we'd like to think, but a cheap price, and that changed the customer's behaviour. So everyone was basically, or certainly at the start, people had bots lined up to purchase some of the things that came cheap, or it was such a popular product that there was a lot of online, a lot of online shoppers. I don't know what that'll do for the camera. But I'll keep going. Yeah, so it basically changed the behaviour. So I can move about more. Make the lights come on. That's what I need to do. That, brilliant. I'll move more. So yeah, so microbursts. So yeah, basically lots of people jumped on the system all at the same time. All had automated bots to buy stuff really cheap, really quickly, and that happened every time clients released products as part of the Black Friday deal. So the Black Friday stuff, certainly in this retailer, it was never a fixed list of items. It was always dynamic. So the business would be there looking what was going on. I don't know what drove the behaviour from the retailer's perspective, but it was random. So that made things even more challenging. That I'm going to sell this watch 1 minute, next minute I'm going to sell a TV, and next minute I'm going to sell this, and then I'm going to sell that, and I'm going to have this many available of it. I don't know, maybe they were buying them from, I don't know, somewhere to get them cheap, and all of a sudden they wanted to try and resell them. Who knows what drove that behaviour? But that was important because it's not just about the order that comes in. That's only one part of the journey. Within that, a split second of one of those lines, that's kicked off multiple messages about multiple things to multiple other systems. So that one thing might have spawned like 50 messages, and then you multiply that by God knows how many items that were being sold at the time, and you suddenly had like a really significant level of throughput across the entire landscape that was completely unlike anything they'd experienced before. Completely nothing like peak, completely different. It was these little microbursts that had everyone panicked. I'll come back to that, but that's essentially how the behaviour changed. So, why were they concerned at all? So they had historic performance, but it's not even historic. They had performance issues. So it was a current thing. Performance of the system wasn't very good. It was known. They had aging technology. So they had a sales order management system in there called Yantra. I think eventually IBM bought that, and then Sterling bought it, and it's been around the houses. But they had it was probably a decade old by the time I got there, and it was, you know, there wasn't that much confidence in it. So the aging software, the existing support team attempted to tune it already. I think this was part of the apathy from those guys. They'd had a go. They'd not been able to do it significantly, or I hope they hadn't done it significantly, given how bad it was when I got there. But it certainly wasn't very good. And there was real concern that how the fulfillment centres would be able to cope with all of these increases in these like microbursts of products. All of a sudden we need to sell 50 of the same thing. It was just concern from everyone, really. The DBAs in particular, They were concerned about table locking, loads of updates all of a sudden happening on one table. The storage team, they were concerned that they'd max out on the IOPS, as they do. They always talk about IOPS. They were concerned that the disk wouldn't be able to cope with the bursts of traffic that would take place. So there was a bit of a panic just in general. This is on top of the fact that everyone thought performance was already rubbish. That was interesting. Yeah, and classic one, there was a real concern by the managers was they thought they'd be selling stock or they'd be unable to update the system rapidly enough to tell some of these people that the item was no longer in stock. And they thought they'd be selling products that they didn't already have. And that was on the back of an episode where items had been sent to customers because they were testing things in a test environment that didn't use obfuscated data. So everyone was really concerned about that. Not the people who received the products, of course. So it was a case of don't panic, we've got this. So what did we do then? So this is the environment diagram that I've created. One of the first things we did was do a risk assessment. So I think it's absolutely imperative when you're doing any performance testing engagement to do a risk assessment. What does really a risk assessment consist of? Well, I should have some. Oh no, I've lost. Oh, lost clicker. That's that. Yeah. No, back, lovely. Thank you.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Me, my fault.
It's all right. So risk assessment. So as indicated by these triangles, that was the outcome of the risk assessment. So what does a risk assessment consist of? It all depends really, but primarily what we looked at the time was do any of these systems currently have performance constraints? So they're already under strain. If they're not, can we do some monitoring on it just to see what capacity looks like on a normal business day in the production environment? Does it look like it's coping? Is any of it creaking? What's the throughput like of these systems? So if I kick an order off to like 1,000 messages, I end up going to this system over here, or is it generally one-to-one, or is it not even related to the number of orders? Similar activity happened all the way through this landscape, and we were able to prioritize which systems were causing us some concern. And it was primarily the high priority ones or the high risk areas that we had concerns with. It wasn't all of it because we needed some to make sure the system worked okay. But we also did, which was again completely new to the client, was we built a virtual fulfillment center. So a fancy test harness, you might call it. So there's some systems you could buy off the shelf to do something like this. CA Lisa comes to mind, but it costs a fortune, takes ages to implement. And then had a budget of 250k. So that was never going to happen. So what we did was we built a fully configurable virtual fulfillment center. So that was important because we were sending messages to it and we were getting significant numbers of messages back. So that was a significant proportion. That wasn't actually under threat itself, but it fed into this system. So I'll rephrase that. So the fulfillment center wasn't under threat, but it sent the messages through to the integration layer, which sent it through to the sales order management system. So that wasn't at risk, but the volume of traffic coming from the fulfillment center was significant. So we had to do something about that. So we built something in Java, if I remember rightly. It was fully configurable, and we could cause delays between messages. We could get multiple batches of messages to be sent through, like on items out of stock or items being picked, being delivered. Sorry, not delivered, being dispatched, etc. So that virtual fulfillment center was a critical part of the overall environment. We stubbed all the low risk systems in the main, anyway. So anything that wasn't particularly important, we created a stub for it. So better to create a stub than to just let it send a message and not do anything. Doing it that way, in my experience, can cause timeouts sometimes, depending on what type of message it is. It can cause errors to start appearing in message logs. If you get a lot of messages in message logs at scale, that causes disk writes. That's then using IOPS, which might have been used for something else as part of the sales order management processing. So it's important that you correctly stub the areas that are involved in the process but aren't necessarily going to be impacted by it a great deal, just to avoid impacting the systems you are concerned with. And then we built, this is kind of a common thing, but we built injectors to simulate all of the traffic that we needed to simulate. In particular, it was simulating customers' behaviour, again, which was fully configurable, but simulating the customers' behaviour of those people purchasing products in these microbursts, and that was on top of a kind of a layer of peak load. So we simulated these microbursts as well. So it was pretty good. It was pretty good. So where did that leave us? So just to start, so the only thing worse than performance testing then, or worse than no performance testing, is if you do it wrong. So there's nothing worse than telling a client that you've got a performance issue, which may then lead them to make a decision not to go live or not to implement the change, if that's not correct, right? Because that can cost them a lot of money, a lot of reputational damage. It's just not a great thing to do. It's like running the wrong functional test, logging a defect and saying, you know, we've got a defect and you even run the right thing. So it's really important that you run the right performance tests. So with what we've done, it left us in a great position. So we at least to 80% was my calculation. We built the ability to reasonably accurately simulate the production environment, which is easier said than done when you take everything into account in a complex environment. So we're in a good state. And then, sorry, I added these bits in there. So what did we build? So the assets that were built were reusable. So it wasn't just a one-off thing. Client could have them forever. They were fully configurable. So because it wasn't just for this one Black Friday event or any regular kind of performance testing. It was fully configurable, so they could use it for whatever Cyber Monday or whatever health kit ever came next after Black Friday. So it was a fully configurable thing. Although it didn't change a great deal between the two, to be fair. And it was also flexible. So what do I mean by flexible? I mean that we built this part of the infrastructure was this virtual fulfillment center. Now, the functional testers, I discovered at the time, so it's like tangent, but the functional testers at the time, they didn't have any test harness. They didn't have any way of simulating a fulfillment center. So it was a complete nightmare for them to test. They actually had to use a real test environment from the fulfillment center guys. Because they only had one instance of, they had multiple test environments themselves, but they could only point to one of them at the same time, as you can imagine. Those people have done testing before and the complexities that caused. And it basically meant there was an environment scheduling challenge. Now, the beauty of the virtual fulfillment center, it meant that we could use it from a functional testing perspective as well. So all of a sudden it freed up a load of functional testing just as a side product. Just really beneficial, but wasn't what we were there to do. Okay, so then the hard work began. So this was the existing system was constrained to a roughly, in fact, this was a good day, 70 orders per minute. But 70 orders per minute. It was usually in the mid-50s, as I've said there. This was after the tuning had taken place. Well, the attempted tuning by the team there. So that was as good as they thought it would get. Thus, why they kicked off that other project. So the system that was under test, and I have got that as a really simplified diagram. I'm not a Yantra expert, but essentially Yantra consisted of backend database, I think it was an Oracle database, and a load of JVMs, Java virtual machines. And those guys were the ones that essentially did all the hard work. So as the orders, it was all essentially multi-threaded. So as the orders came in, these workers essentially processed the orders, and when there was a problem, it was generally with one of these JVMs. They had to restart with the correct JVM. You have to restart them half the time because they just crashed and stopped working. Imagine it, you've got peak loads and half of your farm of JVM suddenly stopped working. You have to kind of close them down, start them back up. Meanwhile, it's like loads of orders are starting to queue at your sales order management system, and it was crazy stuff. So that was essentially the crux of where the problem was. So we began the process of testing. This is classic test stuff, but testing, analysing the results, prioritising our tuning options, and then implementing those changes, and then going back and testing it again. So this was a repeat. Test, analyse results, prioritise your tuning options, implement. Sometimes you implemented tuning options that didn't quite work as you expected them to, made things go backwards. But sometimes it does work, and it's a gradual increment in improved performance. Although to be fair, it wasn't so gradual on this occasion. So that was the process that we went through with the tuning. And the hard work continued. So everyone, as I said, everyone was terrified about Black Friday. Feel free to sit down, Phil. Everyone was terrified. So it was palpable in the office. Everyone was running around like a headless chicken, worried that the system wouldn't be able to cope. Now, we didn't want to really tell everyone of the results from the previous days. Now, I won't go into that just yet, because we still haven't tested the whole Black Friday scenarios. So we improved performance, or at least we thought we'd improved performance, and we thought with Black Friday we should be all right with Black Friday, but let's not count our chickens yet. But we didn't really want to start announcing how great we all were to the rest of the business, because we didn't really know for certain. So we went into a Black Friday testing phase. So we did some random scenarios, stuff like, but not limited to, you know, a single item was in stock, quantity of 50 was released, sold in a minute. Let's make that a little bit better. Let's do 5 of those. They're all sold in a minute as well. Then we did, let's do 20 variations of those items with 50 being released. They're all sold in a minute, but some of the inventory was also sold in another channel. So channel being a term that refers to other places that you can buy stuff. So it could have been in store, for example. And we simulated that activity as well. And then we also, sometime later, I need to say that in French accent. I don't know why I need to say that in French accent. I think it's some sort of comedy show. We ended up doing something like, you could have a random number of items and a random number of stock quantities that were released, sold in a random number of times, and all these were constrained by some parameters that we thought was a reasonable value for each one. And then a random number was sold in a random number of channels. So it was configurable to the point where we could basically produce any kind of scenario that was ever likely to occur. So what was the outcome then of all that activity, all that panic that it set in? So that is a Phoenix, by the way. Doesn't really look like one of the best I could manage online without getting into trouble with getting images. So we tuned the system to the point where it was processing 700 per minute from 70, 700 per minute. In fact, it was so fast, we had to slow it down because other parts of the system started to creep. I think the IO might reached its limit. Certainly, I think the DBA said the database would be fine, but I wasn't convinced. But essentially, we had to detune it because other parts of this architecture couldn't cope with that level of volume. And then whenever, to be fair, if it could sell that many items per minute, they would have been doing all right. Never mind 700. So it was so good we had to detune it. Black Friday turned out, unfortunately, to be a bit of a damp squib. So there was a lot of panic, and I can understand where the panic came from because the existing system's performance was dire, and it probably wouldn't have coped with the microburst activity. No, it wouldn't have coped if we hadn't have already tuned the death out of it to the point where it was able to cope with such high volumes of orders. So it was a bit of it was kind of Black Friday was all a problem about it. And then essentially the confidence in the test and tune track was obviously very high at that point. We could start to pat ourselves on the back and tell everyone we're doing a great job and you know, you didn't need to worry, Black Friday is all right. And we can, you know, save some time for your functional testers as well. And what happened to the rip it all out team? So that actually got cancelled. Didn't need to bother with that anymore. IBM were upset. I wasn't their best friend. But that essentially got cancelled and saved. I don't actually know how much money they did save. I think they were a year into a 3-year program, I think it was. So I assume it was probably 6 million-ish. So saved a ton of cash. So yeah, I wasn't the IBM's favourite person at the time, but you know, I wasn't there to do that. So essentially, that got cancelled, which was great. But probably wasn't great for the people. Like. So the moral of the story then. So I was looking for some sort of really meaningful way to sign up, like the final side, some sort of philosophy, and I found something. I found Plato. Not that I'm any kind of philosophy expert or anything like that, or anything to do with the great thinkers of the world. But I found this. I think it was by Plato. That's like the Greek equivalent of it. Something like this. So testing can costly. I'm sure it was Plato. But can also save a business money, you know, by averting disasters and giving them the confidence to move forward with new ideas. So that was like a meaningful way, wasn't it? I think it was, wasn't it? Yeah, yeah. So yeah, that was the final like thing, and then that's the end of the presentation. I wonder what we've been done for.
Thank you.
If anyone has any questions, those are deeply technical. I'm looking at you. My deeply technical data behind me, but I'm happy to try and answer any questions.
So how did you identify the loads, the load models?
The load models, so
Was that live monitoring or?
it was a combination of activities. And I,
Sorry, Stuart, could you
Yeah.
repeat the question for the people?
sorry, yeah. Andy asked how I identified the load model. So what he's asking there for people who aren't familiar with that term is how did I know what the throughput looked like? And what the throughput looked like in this example is primarily what the orders volumes looked like. So that was a combination of analysing system logs. You could get various systems in place. Data tracing was one of them, which allowed you to track management information such as the number of orders that came through. And then it was a matter of actually doing some analysis whereby we did a single order in the system, and then we had the monitoring infrastructure and all of the environment, and we were able to determine that with that one order that caused that to happen and that caused that to happen. And to be fair, most of the tech guys didn't know what the correlation was between one order to different messages, but it was good to prove that and make sure what we were modeling was accurate. We came up with our transactional volume model. People would be familiar with that term. Our models.
Anyone on the call who wants to ask a question? Next.
I've got a really simple question. What do you do differently?
What would you do differently? Probably charge more. Yes. Probably. It's one of those classic cases of testing is always seen as a cost. Performance testing is often seen as a nice to have. And in this example, for me, it was brilliant because I had a really good team, and we were able to get everything that I consider like good in place. And then we got the right outcomes, so we had technical experts across the board, all doing their specialty to identify the problems, resolve the problems. And we had the testing infrastructure in place that allowed us to accurately repeat test, to explore that, the outcome of the testing. So to me, functional testers may be familiar with exploratory testing. Performance testing for me is very much an exploratory testing event, but just from a technical perspective. And having that kind of infrastructure is very much that ability to accurately do that testing. So it was a really rewarding piece of work.
Is it something they've carried on since you've left?
So it's interesting, well, the fictional retailer, but it's interesting to understand which part of that business is still running. Not saying it's entirely down to this.
Can I ask a question, Stuart? Would you mind kind of like turning around a bit to the camera for us a bit as well? Cheers. So would you consider kind of like your approach to this was how does it fit into, you know, the paradigm of shift left and wider DevOps practices? Where do you classify this kind of like work in that space?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I suppose it's a bit the difference between performance engineering and performance testing. So classically, performance testing happens at the end of a project. Classically, it happens at the end of a project. Performance engineering is about building in performance as part of your application build or development process and infrastructure for that matter. And also having that ability to test and tune components as they're built. So this was, because this was and the type of testing you can do, to be fair, often depends on the type of system that is under test. So if you've got a custom app that you're building from scratch, you can very much build in performance right from the start of that type of process. Make sure your application is performing throughout the entire build process. When you're dealing with a COTS product, a commercial product, then you're limited. You can't really start re-engineering the actual system, but you can tune parts of the infrastructure. In this case, it was the JVMs, amongst other areas. That wasn't the only thing, but you can tune. You can only tune what is available to you in systems like that. So this wasn't a case of shift left, but it was because that wasn't feasible. It was a case of it was a very much test at the end style process, but it got the results that we needed at the end of the day. So, you know, it did what it needed to do.
Thanks. And another question from one of our attendees online. How was it analyzed in the architecture diagram? Which areas were of high risk?
High risk, yeah. So the high risk areas were the areas that were going to be in receipt of high volumes of messages, for example. That would be one of the factors that would have increased its risk rating. If it had any historical performance issues, or it was currently under pressure in the existing architecture, that would have also added to the risk factor. There was also a level of extrapolation, so we looked at what the impact of these microbursts would be on the overall message volume, and we extrapolated that across the different components. And for example, with 50 orders per minute, or 70 as it may have been, a system might have been receiving, you know, 100,000 messages per minute as well. And if you were then to increase that into these microbursts, all of a sudden it might be receiving 300,000 messages a minute. And if it was already creaking, then chances are that that component was going to need some attention. So it was a combination of known issues, extrapolated issues, and message volume. In a nutshell, there's a little bit more than that, which included the infrastructure it was running on, how it would cope with high volume of messages and things like that. But primarily it was those areas.
Thanks. So back to any questions from the room?
Yes, so Stuart, do you have the balance between modeling and testing? So how do you model the expected performance and then you test that it's achieved that? So you kind of create you talk about simulation, but sometimes you can simulation as a model rather as a set of system you test.
Could you summarize that, Stuart? And then...
I'm just going to ask, so what's the question specifically?
So there's performance modeling,
yeah,
and performance testing.
Yeah.
Did you have both of those, or were you just testing and then building a kind of a theoretical model out of that, or did you not build a model at all?
So we.
Ask the question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So basically, did we build a model of what the performance might look like, or did we just do the testing? Was basically the question. So we didn't model what we thought the performance would look like, because we built the capability to find out what the performance was going to look like. So at the end of the day, in my experience, no one believes what your model says. especially if it's not giving them the news they want to hear. So I didn't model what the projected performance would be. I went straight into proving what the performance is going to be. So we went straight into the testing. I think people are a lot more willing to believe they've got a performance issue if that's the case. Because even then can sometimes be a challenge, especially when you're performance testing and you're telling them they've got a problem. That's a lot more of a difficult sell to people. This was slightly different because we were proving performance was getting better. So we were giving them a solution immediately because they knew they had a problem. So it was like tangible results, like rather than you've got a performance issue or you might have a performance issue in production.
Thanks. Any other questions online?
Feel
No,
free to me on LinkedIn and ask me any questions if anything occurs to you.
I guess if there's no questions on there, any more questions from the room?
Well, go on.
I was going to say, you mentioned it was a damp squid.
Yeah.
But obviously it was successful.
Yeah.
How did you relay that to stakeholders? The fact that you invested in this project, did you have a report at the end of it, or is it just Black Friday wasn't as?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mentioned it was a damp squib, and how did I communicate that to stakeholders when it was a kind of a Black Friday initiative? So basically, I always produce a report. That's kind of standard stuff, part of the methodology. But everyone was elated with the results, so that the tuning activity was so effective. Now, to be fair, the bar was probably, I don't want to oversell it, the bar was probably quite low. The JVMs were probably just configured really poorly. Garbage collection was a bit crazy, I remember correctly, but it was probably so poorly configured. Even though the one support guys there were specialists in that technology, clearly they weren't. Plus it seemed relatively easy to tune, in my opinion. So I think everyone was so relieved the fact that all of a sudden they've got this capability to process 10 times the orders that they used to be able to process, that there was like a really good buzz around the project. Everyone was aware of the results, so I sent out regular, test result reports anyway, so everyone got to see how things were going in real time. And then when it came down to like the black specifics of Black Friday, because we'd already tuned it to death, like Black Friday wasn't even a problem anymore. It was like those little microbursts were nothing the system could cope with it like really comfortably. So it was just like Black Friday. No, what's Black Friday?
So Black Friday from technology was a success, but from a business point of view, it was a damn school.
Oh yeah, they could sell a lot more products without any concerns from a production perspective. Yeah.
So I was going to ask, what was the impact on the ops team? I'm assuming
The ops team.
there were a lot fewer reboots to GVMs and a lot less several incidents and lots of stuff.
Yeah. So Andy's just asking what the impact on the ops team was as a result of this tuning activity. So, how can I phrase this? So some of the ops team moved on, to be quite frank. I'm not too sure if it was entirely related to this activity, but some of them did move on. To be fair, there was, in my time there, there was definitely less concern. So to understand what it was like, everyone was constantly on tenterhooks because the system was like creaking. It was imminently going to collapse almost all the time. You wouldn't believe it, such a large well-known retailer. So all of a sudden, when it was just ticking over,
Large, well-known fictional retailer.
a large, well-known fictional retailer, it was such a relief, and the system went from steam blowing out of valves type of scenario to just like ticking over. It was just, there was just no concern anymore, and the level of pressure just like dropped. So I think everyone was generally happy with the fact that it had been tuned so well.
Just a question, kind of not on behalf of kind of small businesses and things like that. You see businesses peak and then collapse overnight because they've had maybe 1-2 orders a day, and then they might go viral on a social media platform or things like that, receive tons and tons of visitors and orders, end up selling stock they don't have to refund customers, website crashes, and then that's their reputation down the gutter, and then they crash and pattern. What kind of basic steps can businesses take to prevent that from happening if you can't necessarily afford the performance testing that these huge fictional retailers can afford?
Okay, so the example that I just question. Did you get that question?
I think we got the question on this one. Yeah.
So the complexity of that environment was probably far and above what a small retailer would require. So the solution that we put in place would be completely overkill for them. So you can do probably 80% of what we did with open source tools. We would classically use open source tools, certain low cost or free tools that still give you the information that you need to conduct tests, but at a much lower price point. So you can still do performance testing at that level, probably good enough for what they need to get to the scenarios that they encounter at a really low price point. Ideally, if they're building something from scratch, got their own development capability, ideally you want to be incorporating performance testing early in the life cycle. As soon as they've built something really, in part of your checking for your code, unit test might run some sort of performance test against, for example, some sort of method or whatever that is being developed. So early testing, but taking into account performance. And the key thing being that you're not throwing a load, like a complete scenario out with loads of users and loads of orders. You're basically putting a particular load on a particular part of the system, and you're just monitoring what performance looks like over time. So that if, like, all of a sudden some developers check something in, and that individual method, for example, suddenly went from 0.2 a second to 0.8 a second. Like, that matters if that method's being called 1,000. So it's about building performance testing in early, and then making sure that you engineer all these performance issues out as soon as
So going back to Eva's question about sort of DevOps, you can build all of this in and effectively all of it, check coding and get performance tested effectively all.
That's right. Yeah.
One more question from online. Touching on what was said earlier regarding performance testing as exploratory, what is your mindset for initial approach? Run various tests to get a feel of the overall system performance first, or stress break it first and work from there?
So I don't equate stress with break it, if I'm honest, right? So, well, ideally not. So I know classically people would think stress would break something. So I know that person is probably asking that. So I would personally. So the reason why the person's asking that question, I imagine, is if you have got a performance target and you want to process 1,000 orders a minute, let's just use this as a really simple example, and you've got some KPIs that you need to meet. If you can run one test at that load and it meets all those targets and it meets all your KPIs, it's almost, I mean, there's more you can do, but it's almost like job done. You've identified to the business that it can meet its peak demand, like with almost your first test. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but you could do it almost with your first test. And then it's almost a case of, do I need to continue testing if I already know the system will cope with everything that I'm likely to throw it? Which is an interesting way to approach it. I have done it that way myself as well. But I've also done that and then moved on to do more exploratory tests, because there's more to performance testing than just will it cope with peak load for an hour, for example. So I prefer to do all of the test types at least once or twice, just to get that feel how the system's coping. But I have also done the whole through all the load right at the start, see how it copes, just to really determine if we've got a problem right from the start. I hope that answered the question.
Okay, thanks. One more for me, and I know we're really like out of time, but everybody likes success stories, but sometimes people revel in some of the horror stories. Surely all of the, in your experience, you've kind of like found some hard learned lessons. Is there any ones that, you know, came off something not working, as in you've done performance testing but it wasn't enough? Have you ever experienced that?
I have, yeah. So frog boiling, as I call this one. So there was an SAP system, and a big SI had come in to do some development of the SAP system, and they'd agreed a set of metrics as to what success looked like, and in terms of performance figures. And there was a particular part of the system that needed to respond in less than, I think it was 2 seconds was the requirement. Now, when the piece of work started off, it was responding in something like 60 seconds. And the SI had been having a go, trying to tune it. Weeks had gone by, still hasn't got any better. And they dropped it down to say like 50 seconds. And then eventually they brought a specialist in, and the performance for this particular area, I think it got down to something like 22 seconds. The SI was patting themselves on the back, telling the customer how great they were, the fact that they'd like more than half the time it took from the performance test, from a performance perspective. And I can remember being in that meeting, and I won't use the exact words I said, but I said the performance was still, so the SI was there patting themselves on the back, telling the client how great they were, and the performance was much improved. And then I pointed to the fact that, you know, performance still is not very good, shall we say, and certainly didn't meet the requirements. But they've done that frog boiling, so they'd slowly warmed the customer up to the acceptance of such poor performance that they eventually signed off on it. In fact, I think, to be fair, I think we got it down to about 8 seconds. But for the type of transaction it was abysmal. And then, lo and behold, we went live. We were the performance test team at the time. We went live. We were getting calls from the help desk about how poor the performance was. I remember the service desk guy coming up to me and saying to me, "We've got all this poor performance." I was like, "Oh, is it in this area?" And they're like, "Yeah." I said, "Does it average around about 8 seconds?" And he went, "Yeah." I said, "Ah, yeah." I said, "Yeah, that's what you signed off on." So essentially the client had been warmed up to accept that poor performance, which was always a bit of a disappointment. Especially when I was I was the performance test manager at the time, and he was kind of almost eyed and done my job properly. But, you know, client got signed up on it.
It's always good to kind of like hear some of the, you know, not so good stories, because people can learn from them. So that's really good to know.
Yeah.
So any other questions? I know we're actually running over the time. So I don't know if there's any other questions. If not, I just want to thank Stuart for like the amazing talk, and everyone, you know, being so engaging and everything. And I'll stop the recording now. So thanks.
Cheers.